Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I thought I would start telling you a little bit about the context. So we're here today on this online seminar on the ethics of BabyHuBERT in particular. So in this presentation, I'm going to introduce BabyHuBERT, which is a speech model designed for child language research. As the title suggests, today, building speech technology, particularly for this population, comes with big responsibilities. So almost half of the talk will be dedicated to the ethical dimension of this work. I'm giving this presentation as the scientific lead of the experience effects on early language, or ExELang for short. This is a project that was carried out thanks to the funding from the European Research Council. That said, the work that I'm presenting is not only mine. It's the result of a collaboration in which I want to highlight the contributions of Théo Charlot, Tarek Kunze, Maxime Poli, Emmanuel Dupoux, and Marvin Lamchin, who were the lead contributors to the BabyHuBERT model that I'll introduce in a moment. In particular, Maxime, Emmanuel, and I and Marvin are officially the BabyHuBERT licensors. The slides and dissemination materials benefited from the work and advice of other members of the ExELang project, and broadly the Language Acquisition Across Cultures team, and Saileti Flex Eilus and Alicia Ortolmastin. This work would not have been possible without collaborators from all over the world who shared data with us. Some of them are present here today, and I'd like to acknowledge them. They are too many to mention, but all of us at ExELang are profoundly grateful. So as I said, there's two parts to this talk. First, I'll introduce BabyHuBERT and some derivatives. I'll explain what a derivative is in a moment. And then in the second part, I will talk about the ethics challenges that this model posed and how we navigated them. So the first question we're going to try to answer is, what works best today in machine learning? What works best is to gather a large amount of unlabeled data, whether it be speech, text, or images. On this large amount of data, we train what we call a self-supervised representation model. And the key learning mechanism behind these models is always the same. They learn by predicting missing parts of the input data, parts that are hidden when we train them. So in any of these cases, we're trying to predict the next word, given the past context, or a piece of the speech segment, or a piece of the image. This first step that happens on unlabeled data that has no human annotation is called self-supervised learning, or pre-training. Once the model has been pre-trained, we're going to fine-tune it on labeled data. Fine-tune it means that we're going to make it more specific. We're going to make small changes. What machine learning researchers have realized is that this whole pipeline works extremely well on a wide range of tasks, whether it be speech recognition, translation, or image captioning. After this last step, once the model has been fine-tuned, we have a model that solves a specific task. And this can be useful in many scenarios, particularly in cases in which human annotation is costly and time-consuming. This whole pipeline is often called the pre-training fine-tuning pipeline. Our goal was to build a self-supervised speech model for child-centered real-world recordings. This is because there are many speech processing tasks we need to solve on these recordings, and asking humans to extract the relevant information, for instance, who speaks when in an audio recording, takes a really long time. This is why we built BabyHuBERT, a speech representation model that has been pre-trained to predict missing parts of the audio. The first extremely challenging task we had to solve was to gather a large amount of data. For that, we relied on data coming from HomeBank or shared with us in the context of the ExELang project via transfer agreements or memoranda of understanding. All of these stated that we were able to use the data in methodological projects aimed at improving annotation quality and developing new classifiers. On this slide, you see the coverage of the data we use to pre-train BabyHuBERT. Most of the data comes from the US. But you'll also notice we have data that comes from populations that are usually not represented in the machine learning literature. For instance, we have audio recordings from Solomon Islands and Timor-Leste in the bottom right corner of the slide. In total, we pre-trained BabyHuBERT on 13,000 hours of speech across 40 different languages. So BabyHuBERT has been trained or pre-trained on these 13,000 hours of unlabeled data. One thing that's important to understand is that this model, BabyHuBERT, simply extracts numerical representations of the audio. What do I mean by extracting numerical representations? Well, there are a couple of parallels that could be informative to you in the audience. Many of you might be familiar with spectrograms or MFCCs. These are fixed formulas that we use to extract numerical representations from audio. So basically, you start with a raw audio signal, you do some kind of processing, and you extract some numerical representations that you can plot into a spectrogram. A spectrogram is the heat map of these numbers. You can also do additional transformations to generate MFCCs, which many of you might know already. A speech representation model of the type that we have been discussing does exactly the same. So it takes the audio as input, and then based on what it learns, it extracts a matrix of numbers. The difference is that in this case, the formulas aren't fixed in advance, but they're actually learned from exposure to the audio that was used in the pre-training. So what can you do with numerical representations of the audio? Not much. If it's used as is, it's not really very useful. However, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, we can then fine-tune BabyHuBERT on a wide range of speech processing tasks. This process is creating a derivative. What does it mean to fine-tune it? In this case, it means another stage of learning. So let's take the case of spectrograms again. A newbie barely tells apart speech from noise, but an expert that had seen many different spectrograms can see in the spectrogram even subtle distinctions, like between the sounds R, Ra, Wa, and La. Another parallel that Marvin gives, which I find really compelling, is the idea of pluripotential cells, namely cells that have not yet specified their function. A fetus is initially a bunch of these cells, and depending where the cells find themselves, they become part of our nails or part of our lungs. This process of specialization is conceptually the same thing we do in fine-tuning. So the result is very specific. Basically, you cannot breathe with your nails or scratch with your lungs. It's the same thing that happens when you create a derivative that has been fine-tuned to a specific task. So in this talk, I will show you results of fine-tuning BabyHuBERT to solve 3 tasks. So it creates 3 different derivatives. Voice type classification, which is identifying who speaks when. This work was led by Tarek and Theo. Addressee classification, identifying who speaks to whom. This was led by Theo. And phoneme recognition, identifying what sounds are produced by the child. And this was led by Marvin. These 3 models are fine-tuned on labeled data, on data that has human annotations. That's how they come to solve these specific tasks. This means that we have given them information on how humans interpret sections of the audio signal. Those are the labels. And through this fine-tuning process, they become specialized. They're no longer special general purpose, contrary to BabyHuBERT. So does BabyHuBERT lead to improvements? Does it allow us to do what we did in our data transfer agreements, improve annotation quality, and build new classifiers? To answer this question, we need to have a few different comparisons. In this slide, we're going to focus on one of the 3 tasks I mentioned before, the task of who speaks when, and compare 3 moles that I will show you in a moment. So let me start by explaining the graph. The performance measure, which is the y-axis here, I don't need to go into the details. You just need to know that it's bounded between 0 and 100%, and the higher you go, the better it is. Now, part of our comparisons came from models that were trained from scratch. So you start from the audio signal and you use your labels to learn the task. You don't have pre-training fine-tuning, you just basically have the model learn the whole thing. We have 2 examples of this kind of model. We have Lina, which is the most commonly used commercial system, accounting for over 90% of publications, and a model that our team released in 2020, which we call here VTC1. They're both in blue because both of these models are trained from scratch. There's no pre-training step, and you're building the model from the label dataset only. We had been stuck with the VTC1 level of performance, which is better than Lina, but it's not so great, for many years. But look what happens when we fine-tune from BabyHuBERT. We observed that the models trained from scratch perform much worse than VTC2, which has been derived from Hubert. In fact, we were really delighted to see that when we compare the performance of VTC2 to the inter-annotator agreement, we see that we're actually drawing quite close to the human-human agreement levels, which are shown here in a pinkish color. The performance obtained by a second human annotator today is an upper bound of what's realistically achievable in this task, at least with the current annotations. So right now, VTC performance is actually quite close to the human performance. So in the next question, in this slide, we're going to ask a different question. Do derivatives of BabyHuBERT outperform those of other representation models? That is, other models that have also been pre-trained on large bodies of data and which are already publicly released with no particular oversight. So these are models that are already available for anyone to download and use. So here we have the performance of 3 models on our 3 different tasks. So 3 derivatives, 1 for each task, identifying who speaks when, who speaks to whom, and what sounds are produced by the child. As before, I'm not going to go into the detail of what the measure of performance is, but it's bounded between 0 and 100%, and higher is better. So in this example, Marvin has plotted for us a comparison against 2 speech representation models. We will show in blue results of a model pre-trained on 1,000 hours of speech from English audiobooks read out aloud by adults. In detail, this model is called Hubert. The orange one is pre-trained on 4,000 hours of English child-centered audio. And finally, BabyHuBERT, which is actually specialized, has been exposed to 13,000 hours of speech that is multilingual. In all of these cases, these 3 colors I'm showing here have to do with the pre-training data or the initial representations. And in all cases, for all 3 pre-training data, there's an additional process that was used in order to create derivatives which are all fine-tuned on exactly the same data, which has human labels. So basically, there's a difference in the pre-training, but in all 3 cases, we're using the exact same data for the fine-tuning. This allows us to compare what's the effect of using different kinds of pre-training data. Here you can see the results. In broad terms, we see that the best performance, again, happens when we're using BabyHuBERT as our pre-training data. So our conclusions are very simple. We have 3 takeaways. The first one is that BabyHuBERT is a self-supervised model pre-trained on 13,000 hours of child-centered recordings across 40 plus languages. We saw that fine-tuning BabyHuBERT works better than training models from scratch, and it also works better than fine-tuning other representations models. At this point, we're going to transition to the question of ethics. In the past, models have been open sourced with permissive license. So to give you an example from our own lab, we released VTC1 with no specific limitations. And in fact, one of the model that I presented previously in orange that had pre-training on English child-centered data was released in 2023 with no oversight, with not particular oversight. And so far, to our knowledge, there have been no reports of misuse in either of these cases. So some of you might be asking, why did we pause before release this time? And there were a few reasons that got us thinking before we actually released the BabyHuBERT. The first thing is that people have thoughts about something like AI or machine learning. The field is changing very rapidly, and the appearance of ChatGPT last year, I think, changed things for many people. And now people have ideas as to what one can or cannot do, or what it means to have your data be used to pre-train them all. A second important difference is that, unlike VTC1, BabyHuBERT is not task-specific. But again, the speech representation model that we used as one of our benchmarks was also not task-specific, and the researchers in that case, they didn't pause before release. But differently from that particular model, BabyHuBERT builds on data from underrepresented communities, including Aboriginal communities. And finally, one big difference is that BabyHuBERT has so far led to sizable improvements in all three tasks that we have studied it in. This means that more people may want to use it, and perhaps some of the people who want to use it are outside of our small field, and we know a lot less about how they manage data security and ethics and so on and so forth. So we thought it would be worth to pause and think. Specifically, what we did was outsource an ethics report. What this means is that we paid an external lab. In particular, we commissioned this work from Dr. Kristen Hens. She is a full professor of bioethics, and her primary affiliation is at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Antwerp. She has a track record on research ethics for sensitive data, informed consent, and the moral responsibilities attached to emerging biotechnology. So she came with a lot of knowledge, not specific to speech technology, but more general on ethics of sensitive data. The day-to-day work was carried out by Mathilde Leon. She has a background in philosophy and applied ethics, focused specifically at the intersection of AI and data ethics. She was also extremely familiar with child-centered ethics because she did an internship with us in 2024. And since then, she has done several pieces of work for a cost action that looks at the uses of AI for describing children's environment, like linguistic and non-linguistic. What we asked them to do is carry out a literature review and also expert consultation. Among the experts that were consulted, we included a researcher who was highly critical of AI, several researchers experienced with vulnerable publication ethics, both in North America and elsewhere, and also ethicists with no previous connection to ExELang. We also required them by contract that the resulting report would be transparently provided on OSF, and it has been made available. So here I give you a highlight from the reports. One of the outcomes of the report was a full table with a list of risks and mitigation strategies. Here I'm giving you an idea of what the columns, what the sources of information that were looked at. Risks were identified by risk names, they were described. The corresponding moral values were identified. The importance of the risk, depending on the severity and likelihood, were clarified. Previous cases and relevant literature were found, and I was able to provide any comments if I thought there were things to look into. So there's a couple of issues I want to highlight here today, because I'm talking to people whose data is part of our pre-training set, or who have data that are very similar. One of the most salient risks that were highlighted by this independent report is the temporal consent gap. What this means is that the original consent forms did not explicitly include the idea of representation models. this risk is considered to be already incurred and very high. It has already happened. We've already done what something that the consent forms didn't explicitly mention. And one of the important consequences of the fact that this has already happened is that both BabyHuBERT and all derivatives, so all specific models, must acknowledge this problem, and none of us can fix it because it's already happened. Another example is challenges to data sovereignty. What this means is that voice data from both indigenous and global South people are represented in our pre-training data. These people might have their own governance bodies with the right to govern data and ensuing AI. They might have it today, or they might have it in the future. So this is a problem. This is a risk that was already incurred. We didn't ask people in the indigenous and global South if they wanted us to do anything specific with their data. We just went ahead and did it. And this might actually happen every time that anyone does a fine-tuned model. We're still not asking them, what do you want us to do with your data? So consequence of it is not only that we must acknowledge this risk, but also ideally that we increasingly involve affected communities and we ask their governance bodies when we create derivatives. Some of these risks are related to other risks. For instance, as people come to see what we've done, the challenges to data sovereignty might lead to an erosion of trust. What we mean by that is that participants and their communities may feel like their contributions, their data, has traveled beyond what they consented to. So this is a risk that is not yet activated, and we don't know whether it will ever happen that people lose trust in the researchers who, for instance, visited families in Timor-Leste or Solomon Islands. This is a risk that may surface as people learn how the data were used, and it might or might not. We don't know. So we see a couple of consequences of this. The first one is that we need to be particularly transparent and open, and we need to be very careful of potential risks of specific derivatives. An additional risk that I wanted to highlight that's also connected to the previous ones is the idea of inherited moral debt. What this means is that downstream researchers, the people, particularly the people who create derivatives, may not realize that we have incurred in moral harm. And they may even think that they cannot be held responsible themselves. What this means is someone who's making a derivative might say, oh, this pre-trained model is here. I can use it, and I'm just going to suppose that everyone has done everything correctly in the past. That's not the case. We need them to know that this is a risk that activates with each fine-tuned model, and so the license must overtly indicate the moral risks and should make it clear that we're all jointly responsible. So a key question that came after with the report is whether we should release or not release BabyHuBERT. One important and basic thing is that some of the moral harms have already occurred. The consent gap has already been done. The fact that we didn't reach out to governing bodies to involve them in the creation of pre-trained models has already been done with the existence of BabyHuBERT. And so we reason that by actually releasing the BabyHuBERTs, we might be able to make some progress. In particular, we can access some additional benefits. For instance, we can take steps to increase the access of the model by people outside our team and our close collaborators, and even make it accessible to researchers in these countries that have been represented, and more broadly, researchers in the global South. The other thing that we reasoned is that the more derivatives are created, the more scientific value there is. And so it makes sense to release because we can unlock more benefits by releasing. Something else that we try to do through the licensing is that we try to open the door to the research community actually learning from this experience that we've set up, understanding the real risks and creating the possibility of future governments that's based on actual evidence and not just fears or a wish to control. So let me tell you about the release framework. The ethics report highly recommended that we go back to participants and get a French consent that particularly covers this kind of model. But I decided that we would not be doing this. So we did not wait for re-consenting. Why? The first reason is that this work of reaching back to families would fall on you, the corpus collectors. And I didn't feel like I could ask you to take it on. It would mean returning to families, often years after the original collection, sometimes across language and access barriers, to explain what a speech representation model is and what the downstream consequences could be. That's a serious undertaking, and ExELang doesn't have the funding or the time to support it before the project ends, which is in October of this year. The other problem is that some people might be able to do it and others not. And a reconsent process that only reaches part of the original sample might actually be worse than none, because it would give us a biased picture and a false sense of resolution. Also, if we wait for proper reconsent and don't release in the meantime, you know what realistically happens? I'm not sure that it will be possible to create another BabyHuBERT. I think most likely there will be no other BabyHuBERT, at least in the near future, with its beautiful representation of a wide range of cultures and languages. And let me remind you that we could do this because of the perfect storm of our team working on this kind of data for 15 years, having all of you as trusted collaborators to share data, plus the local expertise built over 10 years of developing similar models, plus a lot of money from the European Research Council to buy the cluster, to pay full-time engineers who work on this model, not to mention the engineers who organize the data. And so even though, for instance, Marvin has a permanent position, I don't know when he'll be able to support this enterprise or whether it makes sense for him to do this as a young researcher. And I honestly don't know anyone else in our field who would be able to do this again. So something else that was considered and recommended in the report, but I said no to, is the idea of having a check-in stage before people can access the model. And there were a couple of things that were recommended. One of them is to create a permission board. And another one was a semi-mandatory ethics training of people who had access. We didn't adopt these ideas because both of these require staffing that's ongoing, and we cannot really fund this before beyond the point at which the project ends in October 2026. We're also not sure that more gatekeeping doesn't automatically make things worse. There's no evidence either that they would prevent the harms that we're most worried about. So that administrative overhead it's unclear that it's justified. And I was also worried that heavier requirements can backfire regressively. If BabyHuBERT is too burdensome to use or to access, researchers will build derivatives from scratch use other base models, and the weakest derivatives end up where it matters most, having bad performance in underrepresented communities. So instead, what we've done is routing accountability through the license. And maybe in the future, it would make sense for a governance board to think about this, but probably not now when we don't have a lot of information. And so the last thing that this is not in the report, so the report already knew that it didn't make sense for us to use CC4, like a Common Creators 4. We're not using MIT or Apache or one of the other standard open source models. You could say, well, there are advantages to using something like Apache because they're familiar and most models use them. And so we considered it, but we didn't think this was the right thing. Instead, we base ourselves on the SIL-RailM license, which was created with models based on vulnerable communities data in mind. And this was specifically designed with these communities. So we're not inventing constraints from scratch or just like piling stuff on. We're starting from a framework that already assumes that models like this carry obligations, and then we adapted it to the specific of BabyHuBERT. And we really wanted to highlight the ethical issues and rope in creators of derivatives as part of the community. So it's more than just we want to make sure that we draw downstream researchers, anyone who's fine-tuning it, into the same conversation about responsibility, rather than making sure that they just never think about it. So one thing that's important is that our license speaks to creators of derivatives, and one might wonder why. And we think that this is, because since BabyHuBERT just extracts numerical representations, which are not much used on their own, I don't think that people like the people who are present at this webinar will be able to use it with not a lot of work. I think it's unlikely that the BabyHuBERT on its own will be very useful. So necessarily, the people who are present in this talk, you'll probably actually be using derivatives of BabyHuBERT and not BabyHuBERT directly. And so the real power of this comes from processes like fine-tuning. And so this, every time you fine-tune, you add a link to the chain between the people who participated, the people who collected the data, us, and the people who fine-tune. And so every time you add a link in the chain, there's a potential for miscommunication. So we really want to make sure that the creators of derivatives understand what's happened. In particular, we want information to flow both ways. We want to bring creators of derivatives in contact with the research community that collects data and that will use these derivatives, and vice versa. We want the people who are creating derivatives to get to know you and understand your concerns. So to give you an overview of what the license looks like, the preamble is very close to the original CIL-RaIL-M. It explains that the lack of freely available pre-trained models in the majority of the world's languages is concerning. So this is a real concern for underrepresented communities. And expanding linguistic diversity is necessary. However, releasing open access models and datasets representing underrepresented populations can backfire into exploitation of or discrimination against those same communities. So this is something that CIL-RaIL-M already said. The body of our license is also very standard, other than acknowledging the role of DARCL and pointing to attachments A to C, which I will explain in a moment. And then the attachments A to C hold the key information, and they're separate from the body because it will be easier to update them as information flows. So in the body of the license, one thing that's interesting is the representation of the ethics discussion body. The idea is that Marvin, Maxime, Emmanuel Dupuy, and I, we're the licensors. We hold the legal rights, but DARCL is defined as the ethics discussion body. I think anyone who's at this talk knows what DARCL is, but just a quick explanation. It's a community that's centered around a monthly webinar and a mailing list. And so it's a community of people who use these long-form child-centered recordings. And we thought that DARCL was perfect for an ethics discussion body because it provides a forum for discussion of the interpretation of the risks and their consequences. And this can be done through the mailing lists and or the monthly meeting. So these are two ways in which the community can come together and discuss. It can also be done through the leadership, which is a small number of individuals who are elected by the community. And the fact that there's this leadership can allow people to, for instance, express their concerns or respond to concerns with a small number of people if they need to preserve their confidentiality. Something that's not written in the license, but we're explaining this orally, is that we have secured the support of 2 individuals who will stay attentive to the mailing lists, and they will advise the leadership as needed. So there are people looking out for this. It's not, we haven't set up things so that there's a complete dilution of responsibility. We want to make sure that there's people reading any posting or any discussion that comes up that has to do with the ethics of BabyHuBERT, and we'll be able to respond to that. So let me tell you a little bit about the 3 attachments, which have like the heart of it. There are things that people definitely cannot do, and this is spelled out in the attachment A, which has to do with use restrictions. People cannot violate laws. They cannot use BabyHuBERT or any derivative in order to do fully automated decision-making affecting legal rights of individuals. And of course, for derivatives that have generative properties, they cannot generate false information, etc. Something that was pointed out in the review is that there was a lot of concern of use of derivatives for exploitation of children or surveillance. So these are explicitly mentioned as things one cannot do. There were a few things that could raise some flags, but we think that they shouldn't be banned. That instead we should invite consultation. And the consultation would be through the DARCO community. One case is commercial use. Commercial use that has benefit sharing with communities that are represented would make sense. So this is something that people can consider. Clinical or quasi-clinical applications, we know lots of people in the community might want to use it in this sense. And the problem there is that the BabyHuBERT pre-training data wasn't designated or designed or validated for clinical applications. So if you do a predictive profiling of children's educational outcomes or speech pathology diagnosis, it could be the case that the system works less well than you expect, precisely because the vast majority of children who were included in the pre-training data and also in the fine-tuning data for the cases that we have are actually kids for whom there's no concerns. And so we also ask for consultation for anything where the definition of harm might be unclear. So we really want to get people thinking and talking together. The second attachment presents 7 known risks that were highlighted. Some of them we talked about: temporal consent gaps, the fact that participants could not foresee this use of their data, shared responsibility that I talked about a little bit before, the fact that each actor in the chain from data collector to end user is responsible and no one is exempt. And something that I touched upon but didn't go into detail, the fact that even though we have very diverse data, it's still the case that more than half of the pre-training data comes from English-speaking populations. So performance could be uneven across languages and communities, and this is something that people need to think about. So attachment C spells out a series of risk mitigation strategies and organized into 2 groups: obligations, something that we force everyone to do, and recommendations. So the obligations have been represented in this beautiful graph that was created by Flex Eilus and Alicia Horton-Mastin. The crucial thing is someone who creates a derivative then needs to join DARCO mailing list and let people know that they've done this, staying responsive to the mailing list, and reporting any problems that they notice. So this is an obligation. We expect anyone who creates a derivative to do this. In terms of recommendation, we have quite a few that people read through. Some of them have to do with technical safeguards, things that they can do when they're creating a derivative. For instance, BabyHuBERT, we know because of the structure of the model that there cannot be any privacy risks. So you cannot recreate the data that was used for the pre-training of BabyHuBERT, but this could be different in another model. Some of the recommendations have to do with benefit sharing. So for instance, the fact that we have so much data from underrepresented communities, and we want to make sure that that people from those communities can also benefit from anything that is created in this case. We also suggest that researchers volunteer to, for instance, mentor researchers in the Global South. And finally, we have some recommendations regarding community engagement, making an effort to consult with relevant advocacy organizations. So going back to the example of clinical applications, if you're working on neurodivergent populations, it should make sense to reach out to representative of these neurodivergent populations if they exist. So we give a few examples of how to do these things. So one thing that I like to highlight is that I think we've done quite a good job in thinking through the short-term problems and setting up things so that the community can learn from this experience. But we still think that it would be better to do, it would be ideal to do better next time. So some of the things that are a real pity is that we didn't have any mechanisms for ensuring truly informed consent and for providing an opportunity for data sovereignty. We didn't have any mechanisms in place for ensuring more equitable distribution of benefits of the derivatives that are created. And as I mentioned, we didn't have the funding to make sure that there would be ethical training requirements to anyone creating a derivative or to support a governance. I'm not sure that either of those things are good ideas. I think that maybe what we want to do is make sure that some of these obligations and recommendations, rather than being into a license, they're folded into professional ethics that are upheld by professional organizations. So in the world of child development, that would be an organization like ICIS, perhaps cognitive science. Here I also mention ISCA for speech development and the Linguistic Society of America. So that almost concludes my presentation. To go further, you can look at the full ethical report as well as my decisions that were taken a couple of months back. You can also look at the materials created by the ExELang team that will help you get access to the license, get a very short explanation of one page, get an idea of the process for access, and get answers to important questions. And with this, I'd like to end this presentation. Thank you, everyone, for your presence. Thank you for your attention. And until October 31st, we're still here to answer any questions that you might have.